Greetings, viewers. So this is chapter 9 of my chapter-by-chapter walkthrough of my text, The Third Supercycle. This chapter focuses on the Great Depression of 1929-1938. Economic historians, of course, have a raft of periodizations. Some would consider that the Depression ends in 1935. Others date it to 1936, 37, 38. I prefer 1938 because that's the point at which many of the fundamental policies that caused the Great Depression finally come to an end, and a new world system starts to emerge. A new set of policies and profound political, economic, cultural, and social changes happen that point in a very different direction. And the third supercycle reaches a culmination point, that it makes a key decision of where to go in the future. Or rather, there's a key battle over where to go in the future. And one is the path of the Allies, and the other is the path of the Axis empires. So first of all, the Great Depression, it is the worst economic downturn in modern industrial history. World economic production, according to our latest figures and the consensus of the historians, is that real output fell 15% for the entire world system between 1929 and 1938. Now, there is a measurement problem because all the prices are deflating. There's massive deflation, so the cost of goods is falling. So how do you measure real output? So the 15% is more of a quantitative metric. So this is the amount of steel produced and coal and automobiles and this kind of thing. So difficult to ascertain, but our best guess at this point is 15%. And there's been nothing like this in any other recessions or depressions in the 19th century or 20th century. This is truly unique. The outcome was especially bad in a number of specific countries. The United States took the biggest hit. American GDP fell by 26%. Germany's GDP fell by 16%. France by 11%, the Netherlands by 8%, Belgium by 7%, Italy 6%, and Britain by 5%. So this is already very interesting because the new power of the world system, the United States, actually takes the biggest hit, and it's the former hegemon, Britain, that actually takes the least damage in this transition. And there are parallels with the transition that we're living through the world today. It's the post-2008 world, where the United States has seemed to do a little bit better than some other polities, and that's largely a statistical illusion due to some complex factors which I'll address in other venues and other podcasts. Point is, the decline is universal. It affects almost all polities, and there are downturns everywhere with two significant exceptions: the Soviet Empire and the Japanese Empire. Now, the Japanese Empire does suffer a severe downturn in 1929, 30, 31, but then pulls out very quickly because they institute a certain amount of Keynesian deficit finance spending, and they also depart from the gold standard, or rather the gold-backed currency standard. Get to that, the role of that, and causing the depression in just a second. The Soviet example, Muscovite state capitalism, cuts itself off from the outside world, and it launches this mandatory industrialization project. So yes, there's growth, but we have to be very careful of the statistics. The Stalinist system, it's lying to itself. So a lot of the statistics that we have, economic historians, they've parsed the numbers, and there was growth, but the growth during the Stalinist period, on the whole, was roughly similar to the growth recorded by the Romanov Empire between 1860 and 1914. So no real change. There wasn't this big acceleration of growth. Certain categories grew very quickly, but other categories of the economy fell apart. So on the whole, yes, there was growth, but at a terribly appalling cost in human lives. What was unique about the Depression was not just this depth, the severity, it was also the extent, the temporal duration of this downturn was unlike any of the downturns in the 19th century. So we're talking 9 years of pain and suffering, incredibly high rates of unemployment, the likes of which no society had experienced. Rates between 15 to 25%, we think as high as 40% in Germany, 1932. And of course, that's the essential fuel that'll give rise to the Project Hitlerism and fascism in general. And it's not just that. People stayed unemployment for years and years and years. Those unemployment rates stayed high. So the United States, unemployment goes to 25%, and then it stays high, and even as late as 1938, 1939, unemployment is 10%. So lots of people can't make it. There's a huge amount of suffering in society because the existing markets were not functioning as they should. Why did all of this happen? What was the reason for this catastrophe? With the advantage of hindsight, we now know that there were three factors that altogether caused the Depression. Each one of them would have been a problem, but was manageable. The issue was that all three occurred at the same time period, and therefore the old system completely unraveled and became unworkable. The first reason: after 1914, there is no consumer of last resort in the world system. Britain cannot play that role anymore. They're only 1/5 of the world economy, and that's Britain plus its empire. The United States is roughly just as large, but neither is consuming very much. They're putting money into production, but the consuming power is not there. There is a boom in the 1920s, and production surges, but consumption does not keep pace. Okay, so first of all, lack of demand. Second reason, the world economy in the 1920s, after the disruption of World War I, recovered on the basis of a vast export of capital from the United States, so a huge credit bubble. Not within the United States, there was some speculation, Wall Street speculation, but the big story was that U.S. credit was now flowing to the rest of the world. The semi-peripheral economies and polities of Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, many other polities on Earth, so the United States became banker to the world. This was fine for as long as the United States kept doing that. The problem was the business cycle turned in the late 20s, and all these investments came due, and they weren't making money, and so they were cut back. And the result was the United States stopped lending significant amounts of funds to the rest of the world after 1929, and the rest of the world crashes. The third reason for the Depression: the gold-backed currency standard. And what this did was it restricted government intervention and spending in the economy, because each polity that was part of the gold-backed currency standard, and it should be known, the gold-backed standard was the standard for a lot of the core polities and many of the semi-peripheral empires in the 19th century. It stopped functioning during World War I, which was financed by deficit financing, and the polities of the world went back on gold after 1918. Roughly between 60% to 2/3 of the world was on a gold-backed currency standard by the late 1920s. So this is a huge chunk of the world economy, including all the fully industrialized or most industrialized polities. And the problem with gold is just that you're limiting the output of your economy to the production of a mineral in the ground. That's the basic problem. So it's not like a unit, it's not a national currency that you can print when you need it. So you get these incredible supply disruptions, you get credit collapses, and if all that you can spend is the gold that you get from exports, and your exports fall, you can't spend. And what happens is this self-fulfilling prophecy. So there'd be a downturn, things would get worse, so they'd cut spending, the spending would make things worse, they would cut spending, things would get worse, they would cut spending, it would get worse. Just this downward spiral, okay? And they kept applying the same medicine again and again and again, and it didn't work. And after a number of years, people didn't believe in the medicine anymore and started to look for solutions. So, a little bit more on this credit bubble. The economists Cleona Lewis and Carl Schlotterbeck have crunched the numbers and gone back through some of the data, and it's very, very indicative which countries received large amounts of loans from the United States in the 1920s, and this flow powered the world economy. The largest of these recipients of U.S. loans, the largest was Germany, interestingly. The second largest was Canada. Third was Italy, Australia, Chile in South America, Argentina in South America, Brazil, Colombia, Japan, and Poland. So a raft of independent countries, and these are all polities with significant economies in the 1920s. So the United States really does become banker of the world in the 1920s, and when that flow of funds stops, all of those countries go into deep recessions. And then the recessions get worse because the gold-backed currency standard, they're all on that standard, most of them, locks them into a cycle of cutting, austerity, and it doesn't work. So To make a long story short, the world economy starts to break down. And the very first casualty of this is the gold-backed currency standard. So countries start to leave the gold standard because they cannot come up with gold to pay anything. So they just leave and start to issue money on their own right. And what this does is it shatters the world trading system. This is of interest to us today because the world is headed towards a huge trade conflict because the world system is in deep crisis and the surplus trade countries have sort of run out of runway and the consumption isn't there to finance that. So there's a big fight over trade happening now. Much of this history, by the way, is relevant to the 2020s. And the world turned into competing currency blocks. And these were a halfway measure because basically the British Empire cuts itself off and creates a sterling zone. The United States creates a sort of a dollar zone, Central America. France creates a franc zone with the French Empire. Italy tries to do the same thing. Axis Germany creates the same thing. Axis Japan creates the same thing in their empires. The Soviet Empire creates something similar in essentially the ruble zone, though no one wants the ruble, so it's very limited just to the Soviet Empire at that time. So the stage was set for massive geopolitical conflict because once the world trading system is shattered, you don't have the argument against war that you would have had prior to 1914. The thinking prior to 1914 was that, there'll never be a war because everyone is trading with everyone, it would cost too much. And that turned out not to be true. They cut the links in 1914 and they kept on fighting. That cutting of trade links actually happens in the 1930s prior to World War II. There were two main responses to the Great Depression, and the second half of the chapter focuses on what governments do in response to this unprecedented crisis. The two responses occur in two different places in the world system. The response of the five core polities, or rather the core empires, Belgium, Britain, France, the Netherlands, the United States, all five embrace policies that are basically those of the New Deal. So they try to boost consumption power. They start to intervene in the economy. They start to support the right of unions to push wages up. They start to invest in public infrastructure. They start to create counter-cyclical programs. Everything that John Maynard Keynes recommended that goes by the name of Keynesian economics nowadays, which is that in the midst of deflation, you want to actually spend. You want to print money because that's actually productive. That'll stop the deflation and get the economy going again. And the debt doesn't matter because once the economy is growing, then you can tax and pay off the debt, which is what happens in the 1950s, 1960s. So the five core polities start these policies, but they're very, very weak. They're very intermittent, and they're not enormous game changers in the economy. So there's nothing like a fully developed welfare state in any of these societies. There's the beginnings of that. The United States creates Social Security and does some subsidies and creates an employment package and the WPA and other programs to encourage employment. In France, the Popular Front government regulates the work week and increases union representation and does other things. There are similar things happening in Belgium. There are similar policies in the Netherlands and in Britain. And interestingly, some of the semi-peripheries, most notably Sweden. Swedish social democracy starts to do some of these same things. That was one policy track. The other policy track was to adopt the strategy of the war economy. Now, this is something that the next chapter, chapter 10, will focus on in greater detail. But the four polities that follow this strategy, they react to the Great Depression by basically sitting down and saying, okay, so the existing world order is gone. The gold standard is gone. It's not coming back. Britain is gone as the ruler, so why don't we just steal stuff? Let's just run loose and steal our way to imperial hegemony. We'll replace Britain as the ruler of the world. So there are four empires who decided that this was the appropriate strategy. And the very first to adopt these policies, and ironically, is the Soviet Empire. Soviet Empire becomes a war economy, and I define that by at least 10% of its total economic output is devoted to war or military spending of various kinds, at least 10%, sometimes higher. By 1931 or 1932, it becomes a war economy. Okay, the three Axis powers, Italy, Japan, and Germany, will follow suit later in the 1930s as they construct armies and prepare to launch what would become the Second World War. This is one of the reasons that I argue the beginning of World War II should actually be dated not to 1939, invasion of Poland, and not to 1937, when Japan invaded China, but actually 1935. And there are two landmarks there. This is when Mussolini's Italy invades Ethiopia and gets away with it. So no one, the British Empire doesn't stop Mussolini, just lets it go, and this is a terrible idea because the Axis empires start to think that they can just conquer their way to hegemony, and Britain will not resist. The other reason is in 1935, this is when Italy becomes a war economy. So it's the military share of its economy passes the 10% mark or thereabouts and becomes a greater share. The last thing that the chapter focuses on is the very strange divergence in outcomes also led to a profound geopolitical rupture between the core polities and the three Axis powers in the Soviet Empire. So they were not on the same page. So the five core polities, they were focused mostly on internal problems, and they had no idea that the Axis powers in the Soviet Empire were planning a war, and they were serious about a war to conquer the world, which we call World War II. They had no clue this was happening. Their political elites thought of the Axis empires and the Soviet Empire in a completely wrong fashion as essentially 19th century dynasties. So they thought, oh, well, they just have kings, they're monarchies, like the Napoleon III, right? And no, they're not. They're actually fundamentally new systems that are much more violent, and they're able to use the resources of the state to launch titanic wars against the planet in various kinds of ways. So the chapter stops there, and at the very end there's a transition, and the next chapter, chapter 10, shows the ultimate consequences of the Depression, which is the war economies take on a life of their own, and open warfare begins. And the next chapter will be called The Four Instigators, 1935 and 1940.